I'm very excited to talk today to a candidate for the New York City's mayor's office, Art Chang. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I've seen a lot of lefties on the internet kind of float your name as a potential progressive alternative, given that most of the progressives in the race have kind of crashed and burned over the last couple of weeks. There seems to have been this consensus by progressive leadership in New York City to rally around Mayoral, but I wanted an opportunity to talk to you about why you're running and what makes you a more progressive choice than some of the other folks in the race.
Thank you for that. I'm running because, New York City isn't working for anyone, and it's a place that should work for everyone. And it should be a place where everybody belongs and differences are celebrated, right? Not the subject of hate. And we have this moment in time where I look at all the problems and I see all the interconnections, and that's really the key to solving them. And somebody with the right experience has the opportunity to go in and to make a transformational change to our city government. And I believe that's entirely possible. And so that's why I'm running, because I believe that I can make that happen.
What are the kinds of changes that you have in mind? What do you identify as the biggest problem with the city as it's currently being run? And what would you do differently?
I think the underlying problem, which affects everything, is a lack of equity and a lack of restorative justice. The city government itself has been structured and designed not to work for people, especially those at the bottom and people in marginalized communities. It's really been designed for people who have the expertise and know-how to navigate the system. And it shouldn't work that way. And it furthers the inequities that we already have. And now COVID has actually ripped the Band-Aid off of all of that. And we see all the things that are wrong. I mean, we look at, the housing crisis, which is, exemplified by the evictions and the homelessness. We see the safety, the lack of safety, the conflicts that we have within the definition of safety. We still have food insecurity. Education is fundamentally broken. And how we come back to school is really going to have to be much different. And then we're going to have an economic rebound. And what really worries me is that it will continue. We will have a rebound. But will we have a rebound that actually has more equity and more justice for marginalized, underserved communities? And the arts are all part of that. Like New York City is really the city of art. And so if we don't bring the arts back, we're going to lose something about the city. I mean, nobody comes to the city to go visit CVS and Starbucks. People go to visit the city because of our small stores and restaurants and the arts.
Okay, so I know that people who have been following our coverage of the race have heard us cover two debates at this point. We've had Ross Barkan on, who is probably the reporter that's been covering the race most closely, to talk about a lot of the policy differences between these candidates. And so I know that listeners are going to be interested to hear with a little more specificity what policies are that you consider to be signature policies of yours that distinguish you most from some of the other candidates in the race that people are thinking of. And our listeners are probably thinking most seriously about voting for potentially Maya Wiley, potentially Scott Stringer, potentially even Andrew Yang. What would you identify as the policy that sets you apart most from some of those other candidates?
My signature policy is universal childcare, but that's been adopted by most of the other candidates. So I'm really pleased to see that I've had that impact. The thing that really sets me apart the most is my policy around Reboot City Hall, which is calling for a structural change to the governance systems that organize the mayor in conjunction with the arms of the government, together with the relationship to the communities and the city council. It also includes a digital bill of rights that no other candidate has, because when you think about when we serve people, increasingly service is defined as technology. And what we've seen from everything from the delivery of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and how healthcare.gov was a total failure, that we're seeing time and time and time again that actually policy implementation depends upon technology, and government falls down. And the government also fails to protect us and our data.
I want you to talk to us a little bit about your background and why it is that you chose to run for mayor.
I've been working for 41 years. My first job was teaching music. I became a designer and an architect working for IMPay. And then I ended up having this unusual career for the past 30 years, which had government on the one hand and the private sector on the other. In 1990, I went to work for the city's corporation counsel's office. I then helped put Queens West in the ground, which is the first project in the country with universal broadband and planning for climate crises ahead, so that it was one of only 2 projects on the waterfront in New York City that didn't lose power during Superstorm Sandy. And then I spent 9 years on the campaign finance board as the first and only Asian appointed there, and helped co-create NYC Votes, which is this technology that has really transformed voter engagement and small dollar candidate participation. And then in the private sector, I've helped start the city's tech industry. I've created 12 startups here in the city. Half of them have been oriented in the arts. I helped create an on-ramp for students from CUNY into the tech industry. And then education has been a big through theme, not just CUNY, but I also served for 2 years on the school leadership team at Brooklyn Technical High School, which is one of the specialized high schools here in New York City. And then, I grew up in Jim Crow. I was born in Jim Crow, Atlanta. I grew up in a household that faced racism outside the home and domestic violence inside. And so through my entire professional career, domestic violence, child welfare, child abuse, and how we handle and address those have also been a running theme. With the Annie Casey Foundation, I co-created a system called Casebook, which is now the system of record for the state of Indiana's child welfare department.
Part of why I asked that question is, I know that a lot of folks on the left were really excited about the prospect of Andrew Yang during the presidential election. And he seemed like someone who was willing to offer up new ideas, have a willingness to adopt, mostly universal healthcare, but the idea of someone who's willing to embrace policies that had previously only found room on like the fringes of kind of lefty discourse made him seem kind of iconoclastic and an outsider in a way that seemed very appealing when compared to a lot of the other establishment candidates, if you will. But later found themselves really disappointed in him as he, for instance, chose to endorse Joe Biden over progressive candidates in the primary, as he has walked away from some of his more lefty positions, as he's run for mayor and kind of cast himself as a kind of tough on crime. We need more police patrolling the subways without kind of some of the sensitivities that other candidates have shown to the mental health crisis, his comments on Israel, Palestine. And so given that you have kind of this kind of private-public background that in some ways is similar, having worked in the past in the corporate sector, why should voters be more trustful of your pitch than someone like Yang?
That's a great question. So there are a couple defining things. I think, ideas are great. Ideas are actually a dime a dozen. I mean, New York City is full of amazing people and communities who observe the very things that I write in my policies. So the question of having great ideas is really not the most important thing to me. It's how you execute on those. Do you actually build things that start from the bottom up, including the communities and the key stakeholders, to make something happen that has value, that's sustainable, and is repeatable? And I've done those things over and over throughout my career, and I have a significant track record of evidence of things that have actually worked. And I think that's one key differentiator, that you need to do these things that work. Because when you actually use things like technology to execute these, its efficiency can actually will lead to progressive ends. because we're going to have better service, more efficient delivery of service, faster delivery of service, and we can reorient budget to the front lines where things really matter. The second thing is that I think it's so important to have experienced the kinds of hardship that the most underserved communities have. That's how you develop empathy. It's how you develop the ability to connect with people of all kinds. My unique experience of being an Asian, born in Jim Crow Atlanta, and then experiencing, the racism in Ohio. I mean, one story is like, on my first day in kindergarten, the teacher called in the principal and said, I can't teach this boy. And the principal said, why? And she said, because my brother is fighting people who looked like him in Vietnam. And I experienced this kind of this kind of anti-Asian hate that we're seeing right now, so vividly across the country. I experienced that every day when I was growing up. And then I go home to my domestic violence household. And, my mother was one of the first women to study medicine in Korea. She was on a path toward becoming a doctor. But the marriage that she found herself in prevented her from fulfilling her ambition and her dreams, until I was 16, when she was then able to pass the medical exam and go on her own. And then as an adult, when I was in college, I attended Yale as the second man to graduate with a women's studies degree. I worked full time. I worked 40 to 60 hours a week. I worked in restaurants, and every job in a restaurant. I apprenticed in architecture firms. And, I had to pay for my own living expenses, plus pay for the part of the tuition that my parents wouldn't pay for because I chose women's studies as my major. And then, when I came to New York, I came with $400 in my pocket. And, I know what it's like not to be able to pay the rent. I know what it's like even to not even have food on the table. I have an incredible memory that I'll never forget of walking into a restaurant, a Jamaican restaurant that I loved in Fort Greene, where I first lived. And I went in and ordered a beef patty one night. And the owner came out and said, Art, what's going on? Why are you ordering one beef patty? I said, it's because I pulled out the change in my pocket. That's all the money I had. And she went to the kitchen. She came back with a big tray full of food. And she said, here's food. I said, I can't pay for this. She said, eat what you can. We're going to pack up the rest and you'll take it home. And I said, I can't pay for this. She said, you will pay me. I know you will. And it's those kinds of experiences, not being able to pay the rent, not being able to put food on the table. When I started my first business, I went bankrupt. I lost everything and went back to kind of where I started from. And recognizing two things, recognizing that this was a terrible thing I was going through, but what a great learning experience that would force me to change a lot of things that led me to that bad place. But also realizing a few really important things. Like number one, I have parents who got advanced degrees. Like that's a huge step up. Number two, I went to Yale. I had a Yale degree. Like that would always protect me in my career. And number three, I wasn't Black. I saw what my friends who were Black would go through. People who were professionals be able to get cabs, right? Being insulted in restaurants. And I said, this is so unjust. And so I, as an Asian who's been through racism and had these hardships, I recognize that I have privileges that so many other people don't have. And that is deep because you cannot compare my life with Andrew Yang's life.
So Art, here's where, that's your personal history, your personal story is very compelling. But here's where we get tripped up as a community, as a broad American community, and why I think there's so much political distrust at this point, at this juncture. And it's because for the last, I'd say, 20, 30, 40 years of American life, as there has been more access to politics by relatively normal people with middle class or working class backgrounds, Bill Clinton being framed as the first Black president because he had a single mom and liked McDonald's, like this kind of stuff. Like the representational politics really was inspiring for a moment in time. But at some point after the Obama presidency, I think a lot of folks have started to reconsider how far they're willing to take the logic that people's lived experiences will translate into policy outcomes. And, in this very race, you have a lot of diversity among the candidates, including the leading Black candidate, Eric Adams, kind of leveraging his own experience of being stopped and frisked as a kid as somehow a cover for the fact that he is one of the more aggressive candidates with respect to policing in New York as a former cop himself, right? And kind of laundering his, I would say, very conservative and aggressive policing policy through his own lived experience. So it's not that can't be additive, and like a gold filigree on a otherwise great policy platform. But I think what people are looking for, and I think what would be really beneficial for our audience to hear, is perhaps you to compare yourself to, let's say, the leading left candidate, Maya Wiley, and maybe make some critique of where you think her policy agenda goes wrong, and what you would do differently or better.
I'm going to make kind of a broad statement about just kind of where we are as a society. Mm-hmm. We're in this. I really believe that we are in this transformational time. I think representation never trumps doing the right thing. Like, we have to be focused on doing the right thing. And one of those right things means having a government that actually works, right? Because what's happening to people, driven by the internet, driven by all these monopolies that we have, is that the convenience and ease of everything, the personalization of everything in our private lives is growing at such a fast rate. And that stands in such stark contrast to how government delivers its services for everybody, and especially if you are poor and underserved. What happens, because government is the instantiation of our notion of democracy. And if government doesn't work, and then people inherently, implicitly lose trust in government. So the most important thing that we can do as leaders is actually make government work, and start and do it with equity, and do it with this notion of restorative justice. Because if we don't do that, and then we are going to lose this implicit battle between this kind of very, harsh capitalism, versus what we know is fundamentally right. And I believe that so many of the divisions among people who think of themselves as progressive occur because we are all fighting around policy ideas and beliefs instead of figuring out how to make government work.
Well, how do you make government work?
Well, it's going to have to start by working from the bottom up. And I'll give you, let me see if we can talk about an example. Like,
please.
New York City knows what everybody makes, right? Because you pay local income taxes here in New York. So why don't we just automate benefits to people who pay taxes? And why do people need to go from office to office to office to qualify for SNAP and WIC and other essential services to know that you're eligible for Section 8 vouchers or for anything? When a program is launched, why do people have to find out about it on their own and then go and apply for it? Why isn't it just delivered to people who need it? And the same thing goes for small businesses. And we look at all these small businesses who didn't know to apply for a PPP or some of the relief programs. Like, why didn't they just know? Things like, and then we could, there are so many things that just are redundant processes where things are designed, this system of government is designed to impede the flow of information within government and to prevent the flow of information between the government and people. And so if we want to actually make a government that is responsive to communities, it has to start from the bottom up, and it all has to be coordinated and integrated. Education is another example. We talk about something as like universal broadband. I implemented universal broadband in 1994. And look at where we are today. In 1994, the woman I worked for, Zena Abramson, had the vision to say that 2 years after the internet was open to the public, that one day people would need to work from home and that students might actually have to learn from home. And if we had actually kept that going, imagine how society could have benefited. And so we go toward this idea of resilience and adaptation in our society. And increasingly, we see that this relies upon technology. That when we have a pandemic, when we have an economic crisis or a climate crisis, that technology is the thing that's going to allow us to adapt. And we saw this in full flight with all the small businesses out there. There were a small portion of those businesses who had the technology already ready to go, and they just flipped into online. And in some ways, they did better than before. And the same thing with, you look at the private schools. The private schools were able to go and just do wonderfully. And in the meantime, we've left all of our public school students behind. And so we have to think about these notions of having a responsive and adaptable and resilient government, because that's what's going to lead us to a proper society. And then one other final thing I do want to mention is that, where government has an important role where the private sector fails. And there's no more potent example than food. 40% of the food in this country from the point of production to distribution is thrown away. And the entire supply chain from production to distribution is owned by for-profit corporations. And so when you look at the people who cannot afford food and are especially affected by a pandemic, where's the incentive to feed them? There is none. And so what government can do is say, well, we have the ability to see the gaps in the private sector and look at the gaps between what the private sector can and is willing to do and the needs of our communities and step in and fill those things.
You'd be hard-pressed to find someone, I think, these days that was not open and attuned and interested in the ways in which technological inequities fuel broader systemic inequities. And I think that your point about automating social services is a really strong one. I think we've talked on this podcast before about, a friend of the pod who moved into a gentrifying neighborhood and was able to get a small business grant because he knew to look for it. And he happens to be, a white person in a historically Black neighborhood who is able to benefit from the grant zoned for that neighborhood because he has, better information than the people who are supposed to benefit from it. So strong agree there. But technology on its own without a certain set of values can go either way, right? It's not a net neutral. So could you talk to us a little bit about how you define yourself politically and why?
Well, here's some nutshells, nuggets. I voted for Bernie in the last presidential primary.
That's already going to put you ahead of a lot of my Wiley fans. She was not a fan of Bernie Sanders.
He just said such important things. And the thing about Bernie that I think is especially important is that he spoke to a younger generation. And he's, and this is actually one of the things I can talk about my campaign, but it's so important to actually just speak plainly and be authentic and actually talk about those real issues. And another thing is, I voted for Cynthia Nixon, Zephyr Teachout, and Jamani Williams in the last state elections. So those are indicators of how I think and how I believe. I worked on, I tried to help get a referendum passed for a constitutional convention in New York State, and that led to identifying the IDC, this group of 8 Democratic senators who were caucusing with Republicans to block all progressive legislation in the Senate. So I helped promote the identification of them to groups around the state, and then I went and worked, hands-on and helping, Zellner Myrie get elected and helping Andrew Gennardis get elected, and then seeing, what then led to the 2020 this supermajority progressive state legislature. So I've seen those things, and I know that can work. And so, and because I've worked in the private sector, I see both the benefits of how we can draw from that, but also how government gives way too much free rein to people, that we favor the accumulation of wealth and to such a ridiculous extreme. The fact that we don't offer avenues for everyday people who have great potential to figure out how to lift themselves up and have lives with economic dignity. It's like those are learnings, because we're not going to become we're going to have capitalism, for as long as I can foresee. So we have to figure out how to work aggressively to tame it and enable everybody to participate in the economic benefits of our democracy.
This is obviously a ranked choice voting election. So some of the pushback against a candidate like yourself that has less, name recognition and, polling success, et cetera, should ostensibly go out the window. Although there are some concerns about how to most effectively rank folks to best guard against what progressives perceive as some of the worst outcomes. For example, Eric Adams being mayor of New York. But, still, people are going to have this question. Why should I rank you when at this point you haven't, you haven't seen you on the debate stages? Most people know very little about you. Obviously that might change after this interview and interviews like these. But why should they go ahead and put you on their ranking?
I get this question a fair amount, which is, I think you're the best candidate in terms of your policies. They've taken the city's Meet Your Mayor quiz, and I've come up number one over and over again for so many people. And they say, but I think Maya has a better chance of winning. Well, I say, my response is very simple. RCV is designed for this. So rank me number one. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I did a co-endorsement with Joycelyn Taylor, a Black woman candidate who is fantastic. Rank her number two, and then rank Maya number three, because if the two smaller candidates get knocked out as you anticipate, and then you still have, your vote for Maya will still count. So it gives us the ability to, people think about, the blocking, Adams or Yang vote. And I think it's actually more of we can be pro-progressive. We can say, okay, vote for Art Chang, number one, Joycelyn Taylor, number two, and then if you really think Maya's the next one, vote for number three. And, by the way, I think we're also now at a time, more and more people are thinking that way. And so I think Sean Donovan is getting a fresh look by a lot of people. I'm seeing his name come up more and more on my supporters' ranked, RCV. It's not driven by me, but just driven by their own research.
I do recall when we, covered some of the debates in the past, Donovan is an Obama guy. His signature move is housing and ending homelessness, and he speaks on it authoritatively, and no one can really doubt, I think, his his professional expertise in the area. And it was very interesting to me to see people kind of instinctively looking for a progressive alternative after the Stringer allegations and the Morales campaign issues, going to Garcia and not say Donovan. And I just kept asking, well, what's the difference? I mean, why are we imbuing Garcia with these progressive bona fides? Like I'm not for one or the other. It just was curious to me, the kinds of instinctive choices that were being made at the time. But I'm curious to ask you, if I may, who would fill out the rest of your five? You've told us your top three. What about the 4 and 5 slots? Are you thinking strategically about that or kind of principally about that?
I'm thinking principally about it. I think Sean is on my RCV. I said publicly yesterday, Maya is on my RCV. I'm not sure who's going to be in number 5. I think there are a lot of complicating factors. The Yang Garcia co-campaigning was really kind of a mind blower for me in some respects. I mean,
why is that?
Because I deeply respect Catherine and her experience in government, which I think is like one of the most important things that one can have. But being willing to be publicly tied to someone who's made the comments that he's made about, the mentally ill, about policing, about allowing the ultra-Orthodox yeshivas to be exempt from education law. I could just go on and on and on. And then to have, to be publicly associated with somebody whose campaign is run by lobbyists. I mean, I think that those to me are fundamental problems. The Yang campaign has been reaching out to a number of candidates and, to gauge their interest in some kind of partnership. And I think that's I don't know how anyone could do that.
May I ask who's financing your campaign and who would be staffing your campaign and your administration were you to win?
Well, I'll say this: I've raised about $170,000 total, and I have no PAC money, no billionaire money, no real estate developer money. I don't have any Trump political investors supporting my campaign.
Who has Trump political investors supporting their campaign?
Well, we have, both Yang and Adams have PACs that are funded by Trump supporters. And so when you look at the identity of those supporters, it's very troubling. And again, raises further questions. I'm the biggest single donor to my campaign. I've contributed, about $46,000 to my campaign. So relatively speaking, to someone who's self-funded like Ray McGuire, it's a drop in the bucket.
Okay. And I don't want to keep you too long. I told you this would be short, but I'm curious what you do make of what's been going on with the Morales campaign and whether you think it's still worthwhile to include her on one's progressive ballot.
I love Diane's values. I really admire the things that she's accomplished. But I think most of the folks who have come over from Diane's campaign to mine have said something which echoes what's been going on in my mind, which has to do with the job of the mayor, right? Because we think about, given all the press and everything, I think it's easy to mistake the position of mayor as being a purely representational position, right? Of someone who is, like a city council member, making and passing laws. But actually the mayor is the chief executive of one of the most important organizations in the world. And so your ability to manage that and understand what management means, to be able to manage employees and be able to kind of conduct an organization, lead an organization, is really, really critical. And so for a lot of her supporters, they were like, now it kind of like triggered this decision that what she showed was that she's not able, she has challenges in managing, an organization. If she has challenges managing an organization in a political campaign, how is she going to be, managing an organization of over 330,000 people?
Yeah,
and in my campaign, like hers, I have my campaign is almost entirely made up of millennials and Gen Z. In fact, almost entirely, and it is almost entirely women. But because of the size of my funding and for some deliberate decisions, we've kept the team very small and efficient, and it's fantastic. It's been a fantastic experience. I'm so grateful to them. It's just such an amazing team.
I mean, the thing about the Morales blow up is that it also raises these bigger questions about how to handle the sometimes dissonant relationship between progressive values and arguably what it takes to win. And I know that Ben Burgess, for example, wrote a take in Jacobin arguing against, or I shouldn't say arguing against, but making the case in some ways for why progressives shouldn't push for things like unionizing campaigns in a context that will make it less likely that their candidate who supports more broadly the ability for organizations to unionize if it's going to prevent them from winning in the first place and then not having any power to do anything. And I don't personally agree with his take in that article, but it does raise the question, these moments do raise the question, what do you do when there is a potential disconnect between doing the right thing kind of ethically according to your values and winning a race that will allow you to spread those values a lot farther than just your campaign context? I'm curious, have you given any thought to what would happen? I know you have a very small team, but if they wanted to unionize, if they stopped work in order to get higher pay or whatever the demands were?
It's a great question. We actually intended to have a union for my campaign team, assuming that we had raised enough money to have enough people, and but we never got to that point. But I think the real question comes, because I face this with startups, right? I started 12 startups, is, when you pick people at the very beginning, you never really know. I mean, you never really know until you work together. And so there's always some kind of a trial. And there's certain things that you just can't accept. You can't accept toxicity, whether it comes from a man or a woman. You can't accept lack of transparency, lack of personal accountability. And so, everybody who comes in some respects, is always on trial until you develop this trust, right? For how everybody works together. And, and I think part of the art of management is being able to select people who are the most likely to succeed working with you and fit well. And then very quickly get the people who don't match your values out of the organization. And, so this idea that you get to this point where you have 100 people, and all of a sudden it's a surprise, that to me is a very disappointing place to come to.
Fair enough. Well, I've kept you longer than I intended, but I want to give you a chance to give any last pitches that you might want to give to our audience and to let people know where they can find out more about you and to support you if they're interested in doing so.
Thank you. Ideas are a dime a dozen, and ideas don't matter unless you can actually make them happen. And the question is, how are you going to make them happen? And will you make them happen? And does a candidate have a track record of making things happen and realizing those? I'm the most progressive candidate right now in this race, coupled with the only one with the kind of track record that I have making things happen. And so I believe that I'm the best candidate for mayor, and I hope you all rank me number one. And then I'm also co-endorsing Joycelyn Taylor as my number two. You can find out more about me at chang.nyc. One sign of of how I would govern is that I've been holding Zoom open office hours. So people can visit me and talk to me directly. My last Zoom open office hours will probably be tomorrow, but I have one that's tonight that's open at 7 p.m. Eastern Time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Art. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
All right. Thank you for your questions and insights. It was a fantastic conversation, so thank you so much.
Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.